You hear the footsteps before you see the shadows. Reed walls offer no protection when men decide they don't need permission. Your children are just outside, close enough to hear everything, too far away to stop anything. This isn't a moment you can negotiate your way out of. This is the moment you realize your body is no longer your own. This happened, not as metaphor, not as cultural conflict softened by time. It happened in households across an empire that had stood for generations, brought down in a single afternoon of gunfire and steel. I'm curious, are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story this dark from centuries ago somehow finds people across continents who want to understand what really happened. Drop a comment if you're listening. The year is 1532, though the woman being dragged from her home doesn't measure time the way the Spanish do. The Inca calendar marks seasons of planting and harvest, not the Christian saints' days that her captors mutter as they divide spoils. The city is Cusco, nerve center of an empire that stretched from modern Colombia to Chile. A civilization of engineered terraces and knotted string records, now collapsing under the weight of smallpox, civil war, and 168 Spanish soldiers who understood exactly what they wanted. Francisco Pizarro's men didn't just take gold, the official royal records preserved in Seville's Archive of the Indies list the distribution of labor grants, land parcels, and people. People, the word used in Spanish administrative documents, is indios de servicio, Indians for service. Women appear in these ledgers not by name but by function: domestic labor, textile production, tribute obligations. But the letters between conquistadors, the notarial records kept by colonial scribes, the testimonies recorded decades later by priests trying to impose order on chaos, these reveal what the official documents coded in bureaucratic language. Women were taken into Spanish households, not just to weave and cook. Pedro César de León, a chronicler who arrived in Peru in 1547, wrote with surprising directness about what he witnessed in the years immediately following conquest. He described Spanish soldiers entering compounds, selecting women, and removing them from kin networks that had protected them for generations. Bernab Cobo, another Spanish observer, documented the systematic appropriation of a clicuna, the chosen women who had been ritual specialists, textile artists, brides reserved for Inca nobility. After conquest, these women were baptized, given Spanish Christian names, and distributed to Spanish households. Their specialized knowledge, their sacred status, their institutional protection all dissolved the moment a Spanish captain decided they were spoils. The archaeological record speaks where documents fall silent. Excavations at Huánuco Pampa, a major Inca administrative center, show abrupt changes in domestic architecture after 1532. Household compounds that had followed. Inca spatial logic organized around communal cooking areas. Textile production zones, family sleeping quarters were suddenly reconfigured. New walls went up. Access points changed. The distribution of artifacts shifts. Spanish ceramics appear alongside Inca vessels, European metal tools next to traditional stone implements. It's the material signature of forced cohabitation, visible in stratified layers of earth. But it's the bones that testify most directly. Bioarchaeological studies of colonial Lira cemeteries near Cusco and Trujillo reveal skeletal trauma patterns that appear suddenly after conquest. Female remains show increased rates of healed fractures, perimortem injuries to ribs, forearms raised in defense, facial bones struck with blunt force. Cribra orbitalia, a pitting of the eye sockets caused by anemia, spikes in frequency. Enamel hypoplasia, horizontal grooves in teeth that mark periods of severe malnutrition or illness during childhood, becomes more common. Isotopic analysis of bone collagen, carbon, and nitrogen ratios that record diet over a lifetime shows a sudden decline in protein access among women. These aren't abstract data points. They're hunger, violence, and chronic stress written into the body's permanent record. There's a legal framework that's supposed to prevent this. The Laws of Burgos, drafted in 1512 to 1513. represents Spain's first attempt to regulate treatment of indigenous people in the Americas. The ordinances explicitly forbid abuse of indigenous women and children. They mandate Christian instruction, limit labor obligations, require adequate food and shelter. The text survives in legal compilations cited in subsequent royal decrees, invoked in court cases. On paper, indigenous women under Spanish authority have protections, but law is only as strong as its enforcement, and enforcement requires someone with power who cares. In practice, the encomienda system royal land grants that included rights to indigenous labor created a structure where abuse was incentivized. An encomendero received tribute and labor from indigenous people assigned to his grant. The more labor he extracted, the wealthier he became. Women's labor included textile production, food preparation, child-rearing. But there was another form of extraction that the laws addressed only obliquely: sexual access. Missionary letters from the 1530s and 1540s, preserved in Dominican and Franciscan archives, record complaints about encomenderos treating indigenous women as concubines. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar whose writings would shake the Spanish conscience, cataloged these abuses in his 1552 account, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. He describes sexual violence not as isolated incidents, but as systemic practice, a consequence of a colonial structure that treated people as resources to be exploited. The Church intervenes, but its intervention is complicated. Bishop visitations, inspection tours by high-ranking clergy meant to assess local conditions, produce reports filled with contradictions. Some priests shelter indigenous women in mission compounds, attempting to protect them from Spanish soldiers and settlers. Others participate in the very systems they're supposed to regulate. Parish baptismal registers from the 1540s onward record a sudden explosion of births classified as mestizo mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. The mothers' names appear in careful script. The fathers' names often don't, or appear as unknown or simply Spaniard. These registers, preserved in local parish archives across Peru, are demographic evidence of widespread sexual relationships, consensual and coerced, that produced a new generation whose very existence challenged Spanish legal categories. One case survives in unusual detail. In 1551, an indigenous woman named Inés Huelas petitioned the Audiencia of Lima, the royal court with jurisdiction over the viceroyalty. The case file, preserved in the Archive of the Indies, includes her testimony, witness statements, and the court's judgment. Inés had been taken into the household of a Spanish encomendero after the conquest. She bore him 2 children. When he decided to marry a Spanish woman arriving from Seville, he attempted to remove Inés from his household without providing for her or the children. Inés sued for maintenance and recognition of her children as his legitimate heirs. Her petition is a window into a world of impossible choices. She argues in terms the Spanish court will understand. She had lived as his wife, managed his household, borne his children. By Spanish legal logic and Christian morality, he owes her marriage or at minimum financial support. But she also argues from Inca legal concepts, invoking pre-conquest ideas about obligation and kinship. Her petition is a hybrid document navigating between 2 legal worlds, written by a bilingual scribe trying to translate realities that don't map cleanly onto Spanish categories. The court rules partially in her favor. The encomendero is ordered to provide a dowry and ongoing support. It's a victory, of sorts. But the case file also reveals what didn't make it into the official judgment. Witness testimony describing how Inés was removed from her family's compound at age 14. How she had no choice in becoming part of the Spaniards' household. How she learned Spanish because she had to. How she converted to Christianity because the alternative was being classified as an obstinate pagan subject to harsher treatment. Her story is one of resilience and strategy. It's also a story of coercion and survival within a system that offered no good options. Not every woman had access to courts. Not every woman had witnesses willing to testify. Not every woman survived long enough to petition for redress. The demographic collapse of the Andes in the 16th century is one of history's great catastrophes. Conservative estimates suggest the indigenous population declined by 80 to 90% in the century following contact. Smallpox, measles, typhus diseases, to which Andean populations had no immunities, wept through communities in waves. Chronicles describe villages emptied, fields left unplanted, children orphaned in such numbers that traditional kinship networks couldn't absorb them all. The skeletal record from mass graves and colonial cemeteries confirms what the documents describe: a population in collapse, with mortality rates highest among the very young and the very old. This demographic catastrophe compounded women's vulnerability. When communities lose half their population, social structures that protect individuals' extended family networks, communal labor obligations, ritual kinship systems, fracture. Women who might have had brothers, uncles, fathers to intervene on their behalf found themselves without protection. The Spanish legal system theoretically offered recourse, but accessing it required literacy, knowledge of Spanish legal procedure, money for notary fees, and a willingness of Spanish authorities to hear indigenous complaints against Spanish settlers. Some women found protection in an unexpected place: convents. By the late 16th century, convents in Lima and Cusco began accepting indigenous and mestiza women. Convent records, account books that tracked donations and residents, show a surprising diversity. These institutions offered education, safety from sexual predation, and a socially recognized role. They also imposed strict discipline, required dowries that many couldn't afford, and separated women from their families and communities. For some women, the convent was sanctuary. For others, it was another form of captivity, softer perhaps than concubinage, but still a constraint on autonomy. The paradox runs through everything. Protection comes with control. Safety requires submission. Survival demands negotiating with the very systems that created vulnerability in the first place. And through all of this, women continued to weave. Textile fragments recovered from colonial-era domestic sites show continuity in Inca weaving techniques, iconography, and materials, even as political structures collapsed around them. Spindle whorls, loom weights, and weaving tools appear in archaeological contexts alongside Spanish goods, suggesting that textile production, traditionally women's work, persisted as both economic necessity and cultural practice. Spanish demand for textiles was insatiable. Fine Andean cloth was a valuable trade commodity. But weaving was also memory work, a way of preserving patterns and techniques that carried meaning independent of Spanish oversight. These fragments, preserved in museum collections and excavation reports, are small rebellions. They're evidence that cultural transmission continued through women's hands even when institutions and authorities tried to erase everything else. By the early 17th century, a new social order has calcified. Legal categories based on ancestry, Spagal, mestizo, Indio, mulatto, Zambo define rights, obligations, and social possibilities. Casta paintings, a genre of colonial art that depicted racial mixing in ordered hierarchies, visualize this system. They show families arranged by ancestry, each mixture codified, each category assigned a place. Women appear in these paintings as mothers. Their bodies the sites where categories blend and new classifications emerge. The violence hasn't ended. It's been bureaucratized, systematized, woven into the social fabric so thoroughly that it becomes almost invisible just the way things are. Parish registers from the 1600s record marriages, baptisms, deaths in neat columns. Beneath the administrative tidiness, patterns emerge. Indigenous and mestiza women marry later than their pre-conquest ancestors did, if they marry at all. Rates of children born outside marriage remain high. Life expectancy for indigenous women is lower than for Spanish women in the same towns. These are statistical shadows of ongoing inequality, demographic traces of structural violence that no longer requires individual acts of cruelty because the system itself produces the harm. And yet, resistance never fully disappears. Legal petitions continue through the colonial centuries, indigenous communities suing to protect land, women seeking maintenance from Spanish partners, villages demanding enforcement of labor protections. Some succeed. Many don't. But the archive of petitions itself is evidence. People continue to believe that law could matter, that justice was possible, that their voices deserved to be heard. It's not triumphant, but it's not total defeat either. It's the exhausting, grinding work of survival and the refusal to accept that what happened was inevitable or acceptable. The bones remain. In cemetery excavations, in museum collections, in repatriation disputes between governments and communities. The physical evidence of colonial violence persists. Archaeologists and descendant communities now work together to interpret these remains with care and dignity, to tell stories that center indigenous experience rather than colonial narrative. The work is slow, often contested, always ethically complex. Because this isn't just history. The hierarchies established in those early decades of conquest shape societies in ways that echo forward. Disparities in wealth, health, legal protection, these have colonial roots that remain visible in data and policy today. There's no clean ending to this story, no moment where justice arrives and suffering is redeemed. What happened to Inca women after conquest wasn't a tragic chapter that concluded. It was a beginning of new social formations built on dispossession, of legal systems that codified inequality, of cultural transformations negotiated in the most intimate spaces of human life. The woman from the opening, whose children listened outside while Spanish soldiers held her down, appears nowhere in the archive by name. She's statistically probable, materially evidenced, legally invisible. Her existence is confirmed by the patterns and bones in birth registers, in the structural logic of colonial extraction, but her voice is lost. What remains is the obligation to look directly at what happened, to resist the comfortable distance of euphemism, to name sexual violence and coercion as tools of empire as deliberate and systematic as taxation or forced labor. She was there. They were there. Thousands of them, across an empire that stretched thousands of miles. Facing choices that weren't really choices, surviving in ways both remarkable and unbearably costly. The archive remembers. The earth remembers. The descendants remember, even when the names have been forgotten. And now we remember too.